Hi everyone, and welcome to my next topic, complex sound perception and music perception. Now, so far, quite honestly, we've been considering sound in a very artificial and simplistic way. Like, what if there is just one pure sine wave tone? Okay, that doesn't happen in the real world, so we're going to be moving out into the real world, looking at how we hear in a naturalistic environment. And then, yes, some music perception too. Here are the learning objectives. So we'll take a look at what kind of information we can use in sound to localize where that sound is coming from. I'll discuss something called the precedence effect, looking at how visually impaired people can use sound for things that we can too, but this is especially relevant for them for localization and for locomotion. I'll talk a little bit about reverberation, which does tie a little bit into music perception as well, and then taking a look at two mechanisms that play into auditory scene analysis, and I'm going to be bringing back the Gestaltists for this one. Next, switching gears, I'll take a look a little bit at how music is processed in the brain. This is something that's really an exploding area of research in the past 10 to 15 years or so, and then more specifically, we'll examine the so-called Mozart effect. That is, should you play Mozart for your newborn baby, or even if someone is pregnant, should you hold up headphones to their stomach and play Mozart so that you can turn your child into a genius? Yeah, we'll take a look at the evidence for and against that. But first, some auditory localization. It's something we take for granted. We probably don't think much about it, but it's all about knowing where a sound is coming from. It just happens automatically, but there's certain pieces of information that are required for us to localize and know where it's coming from. One of those is interaural level differences. Okay, a lot of technical mumbo jumbo, but it means between ear differences in the intensity of the sound. So let's take a look at our head. This is a head, by the way. This is me when I try to draw digitally. Okay, so we're looking down on this person. I guess they have no hair. Hair is really tough to draw. Okay, so that's their head. We've got their two ears. There's their eyebrows, and that's quite a nose. Okay, so we're looking down at a person, and this is supposed to be a tuning fork. Okay, that is a sound source. Okay, so we're looking at the azimuth. So we're not looking at moving the sound source like above or below the plane of the head. So it is in line with that. Okay, so we're not looking at it fully three-dimensionally. As you move that sound source off from being directly in front of you, you can, to some extent, tell where that sound is coming from because of interaural level differences. Okay, so what I've tried to draw here in this picture is a sound shadow. Now, if you take a look at the sound that comes and hits this person's left ear, okay, it hits that ear directly. There's nothing blocking that ear. But if we look at the sound coming to their right ear, it's in, well, this kind of gray shaded area, which I've labeled sound shadow. Okay, those sounds still reach the right ear, but they have to kind of bend around the head, and the head is blocking some frequencies. Your head is a dense object. No offense. I mean, so is mine, okay? So not all frequencies are going to pass through the head. The head does block some of those. So what we end up with essentially is that the same sound waves are reaching both ears, but there's small to moderate differences in the intensity of that sound. And we don't interpret it as, hey, that exact same sound is a little bit quieter in my right ear than my left ear. We don't experience it that way. We experience it as, oh, the sound source is off to my left. It's like a certain distance off of the azimuth. These differences can be moderate to large, up to 30 decibels of difference, and this does affect mostly higher frequencies. Lower frequencies quite easily pass right through your blockhead. No offense. Okay, this is one of the pieces of information. We also have another one. This is interaural time differences. So once again, between ear differences in time. And I'm going to use the same exact picture because it applies. There's something there that I haven't mentioned yet. What this refers to is the arrival time of the same sound. It's not equal to both ears when the sound source is moved off to the side. If it's directly in front of you, it should reach both ears at exactly the same time. So if we take a look at the sound waves again, in this case, the left ear gets the sound, and the sound has to travel this distance. To reach the right ear, that same sound has to go like this extra distance. It's a few centimeters. So what that means is that by the time the sound reaches the right ear, well, it reached the left ear already a few milliseconds earlier. Now this is kind of logical. I can draw you these diagrams, but we also have evidence that supports it. There are neurons found in our auditory cortex and a part of the brain called the superior olive that respond specifically to time differences in sound. So if the brain has set aside neurons for this purpose, it doesn't just do that and waste neurons. This neuron is performing a function. We can detect differences as small as 10 microseconds. And again, it's not like, oh, the same sound reached my right ear 10 microseconds after. No, that's not how we experience it. Again, we just experience it as, oh, the sound is over off to the left. For various reasons, interaural time differences more applies to lower frequencies. When we have very high frequencies, we get peak, trough, peak, trough, peak, trough, all these peaks and troughs coming very, very quickly, and then it's much more difficult for the auditory system to compare between the ears. Okay, that's the first. We got two more coming up. The next one is phase differences, and this goes way back to my previous lecture in part 1. If you remember, I described the phase of a wave, and then I kind of facetiously said, and I just wasted your time because we cannot perceive the phase of a wave. And of course, the key word there was the word ah. Yeah, we cannot perceive the phase of a wave, but we can compare the phase of two waves to each other. So let me just illustrate here. So we have two tones. Basically, the way to think about this is the top one is reaching one ear, and then the bottom one is reaching the other ear. So it also plays into a time difference, an arrival time difference. And just to keep the numbers nice and round, I've decided to make these 1000 hertz tones. So one cycle going from 0 degrees and going back to 360, that takes 1 millisecond, okay? And I've set the difference in arrival time to be 0.5 milliseconds. Yeah, I'm kind of cherry picking numbers, but it's illustrative. So what this means is that 0.5 milliseconds later, the same sound reaches our other ear. So arrival time difference of 0.5 milliseconds. It's otherwise exactly the same sound wave. It's got the same period and everything. The difference is at any point in time, so right here at 0.5 milliseconds of time, we can compare the two waves to each other. Now the top wave is at 180 degrees of phase, whereas the bottom one is at 0. That's a difference of 180. I can take another point in time, like right here. This wave is at 270, and this one is at 90. Oh, that's hard math. 270 minus 90. You know what? It's easy because it's also 180 degrees difference of phase. At any point in time, comparing these two waves to each other, the difference is going to be 180 degrees. And again, we can pick up on that. We can pick up on phase differences between the two ears. And again, this works better for lower frequencies. For higher frequencies, again, the peaks and the troughs are coming so quickly that a comparison of the phase really can't be made. And I've got one more piece of information that allows us to localize sounds, and that is your pinna, which, of course, you'll remember. Just smile and nod. Oh yes, the pinna, right, the fleshy cartilaginous bit of tissue that's hanging off of the side of your head. Unless you don't have pinna, in which case, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I hope it didn't trigger you. What the pinna does with all the lumps and the bumps and the grooves and everything, what that does is it serves to delay some frequencies. It amplifies certain other frequencies depending on where their source is. So where are they coming from in terms of azimuth and also in terms of elevation? Are they above your head, below your head? Are they in the same plane as your head and your ears? Now, this seems to work mostly on mid-range frequencies, especially it damps the intensity of these mid-range frequencies if they are behind your head. So if you kind of consider your ears as like sort of radar dishes, kind of radar dishes that are pointed forwards, okay, if there's a sound that's behind you, oh, well, now your pinna itself is kind of getting in the way of those sounds. And if the sound is directly in front of you, say 1.5 meters versus 1.5 meters directly behind you, it's going to sound different because of your pinna. Now, this has been apparently taken advantage of by a company called Q Labs, originally based in Calgary, but I don't hold that against them. And they developed a technology that they called Q Sound Registered Trademark, which is a positional 3D sound processing algorithm. And this was developed starting in the 1990s, I think it was, because a lot of people were listening to music with earbuds and headphones. So some people complained that the sound wasn't as immersive. So if you're listening to music, it just doesn't sound like it's alive. It sounds very different if you're listening to it with speakers, for example, because if you're listening to it in an open environment, it'll hit your pinna and bounce around a little bit, and you'll get more of a positional experience. So what this Q-Sound technology tried to do was simulate this effect of the pinna. So it's basically passing it through a filter that artificially takes the place of your pinna, so that if you're listening to music with earbuds or headphones, it'll sound very immersive and more three-dimensional. Wow, that was a long explanation. Okay, let's get to the fun part. I do have a demo from Q-Sound in which they demonstrate this technology. I hope you're wearing earbuds or headphones. It'll work best if you listen to it this way. Here we go.
Thanks for taking the time to hear the power of 3D audio by Q-Sound Labs. First, here's the demo in regular stereo.
Traffic 10, heavy on downwind lake to your left.
Roger, 10 heavy, downwind left.
Contact departure control 120.8.
Roger, control 120.8. Requesting clearance for departure.
10 heavy, your ground clearance for takeoff. Right, heading 080, climb and maintain 5,000.
Roger, control, right, 080, 5,000.
Now, here's that same demo in Q-Sound.
Traffic 10, heavy on downwind lake to your left.
Roger, 10 heavy, downwind left.
Contact departure control 120.8.
Roger, control 120.8. Requesting clearance for departure.
10 heavy, your ground clearance for takeoff. Right, heading 080, climb and maintain 5,000.
Roger, control, right, 080, 5,000.
Q-Sound.
What did you think? Could you tell a difference between those two? Yeah, I couldn't either. You can get the Q-Sound as a downloadable plugin for your computer and make everything more 3D, but I'm just not getting it. If you take a look at some CDs produced in the 90s, I know Madonna had some CDs that had a teeny tiny little Q-Sound logo, and people said it sounded better, but I don't know. I also have another problem with that video. They gave clearance to that aircraft, and then it was already taxiing on the runway. Like, that's not the way that works. Okay, anyway. I have one final piece of the puzzle for complex sound localization. It is something called the precedence effect, which is something that you can try to set up yourself. What you'll need to have is two speakers that are presenting the exact same sound. And you have to arrange these speakers in just the right location, and specifically how distant each speaker is from you and your ears. Now, the important thing is that the speakers are not equidistant from your ears, otherwise this just doesn't work at all. So if you position the speaker so that one is closer and the other is a bit farther away, what you get is a delay in when the sound reaches you from each of the two different speakers. Now, there's a phenomenon that at shorter delays, less than about 2 milliseconds, or if it's absolutely simultaneous, meaning the speakers are equidistant, even though there is a difference of 2 milliseconds of arrival time, you don't experience that. What you experience is one holistic sound, and that's called fusion. If you manipulate it so that there's a much longer delay of 35 milliseconds, so this means one speaker, say the left one, is pretty close, the right one is like way far away from you, such that it takes 35 milliseconds longer for the sound to reach you, you now get kind of an echoey sound. Okay, so there's what's called the echo threshold at 35 milliseconds or longer of a delay. So in between about 3 milliseconds and about 34 milliseconds, this is where the precedence effect lives. It works best between about 5 to 20 milliseconds. So there is a measurable difference in arrival time. There is a delay. And what you experience is that the sound is coming from the leading speaker only. So again, if the left speaker is close to me, the right one is really far away, and it creates this 20 millisecond difference in arrival time. The funny thing is, I hear the sound coming from the left speaker only. It's as if the right speaker isn't on. This sometimes happens maybe if you're in a vehicle, if you're in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, you're going to be closer to the speakers that are in the door next to you rather than the door opposite to you. And sometimes the delay can be right in this sweet spot that generates the precedence effect. And I've been in cars and people go, I don't know if your speaker is on. Mine is on, but I don't think yours is on. And I tell them the exact opposite thing. Oh, I can hear the sound coming out of my speaker. I think your speaker is off. A vehicle is not the ideal environment for listening to music, okay? Because of this precedence effect phenomenon. It's kind of a strange thing that this would happen. What's happening is that the lagging sound, the one that's more delayed, is suppressed. So it's not that the waveforms cancel out or anything. No, that has been mathematically disproven. That is not the cause of it. Our auditory system is turning off that second sound. Now, there is some speculation about why it might be doing this. If you're getting lots of echoey sound, it's really confusing. You don't know where the sound is coming from, and it's overlapping, and it's terribly confusing. So your auditory system tries to compensate to some extent for that. It can't do it perfectly. So above 35 milliseconds, it's like, I'm out. I can't do anything. But between about 5 and 20 milliseconds, your auditory system is trying to suppress that lagging sound so you can make sense out of the leading sound, at least. Now that brings me to echolocation. There are animals, of course, that can send out sounds and then pick them up again. They can hear them and they can extract information about their environment from this. Animals like, of course, humans. Yeah, and bats. Bats too. But I'll get to the humans because that's kind of unexpected. So of course bats have echolocation. They send out ultrasonic waves which bounce off of obstacles or prey, and they bounce back to the bats, and with their amazing hearing, they can make some sense out of those echoes. So they might be able to locate things even though their vision is not great. Now the thing about echolocation is it can be used by people as well. It is used by visually impaired and blind people. And some people think, well, that's because they can't see and their ears are much more sensitive, and that's not necessarily the case. They're paying much more attention to the information that they have available. But that's not to say that this is only usable by blind or visually impaired people. Anyone can use their sense of hearing to do some echolocation and localization. So here's some research that backs this up. So classic research from 1953, they took people who were just absolutely normal in terms of seeing and hearing, and they blindfolded them. And then, hilariously, they had them walk toward obstacles placed at a number of different distances away. Okay, so again, people are blindfolded, they can't see the obstacles, and of course people would trip over them, and it was pretty hilarious. But as they did it more and more and more, they were able to avoid the obstacles. And you might think, well, of course, they're just learning where they are. But what the researchers would do is actually move them around from trial to trial, and people were still able to avoid them, which is pretty amazing. Until the researchers put earplugs in the participants, and then once again they were stumbling and tripping, and they never got any better as these obstacles were moved around. Now this is pretty conclusive evidence that what they were doing is somehow using audition to localize where the obstacles were. Crazy. So here's another experiment along those lines using a standard stimulus, which was a pretty solid heavy wooden disc about 30 centimeters in diameter, placed about 20 feet away. And then there was another disc, a comparison, and this one was moved closer and farther away. They actually recruited blind participants, and they asked them how far away the comparison disc was. These are people who are blind. Now, the participants were not able to move around or anything. They had to just stay rooted on the spot. But they were allowed to make any noise that they wanted. And they made noises. They made clicks and clucks, and they tapped their feet, and they made all kinds of noises, paying attention to the echoes. And this is how good they were. They could ascertain the distance of the comparison plus or minus 2 feet, which is amazing. That's amazing. Now again, don't misinterpret this as, oh yeah, blind people are amazing. They just have a lot of experience doing this. They've kind of had to do this. Anyone could presumably learn to do this if you spend enough time trying to do it. Now, this explains why if you see a blind person walking along the street, they often have that white cane. The white cane isn't to bump against things. If you watch carefully, what they do is they tap it, and they pay attention to the echoes of the taps. And they can get really, really good at determining where obstacles are just by the tapping and the echoes that are made. Now, in some of my research as a graduate student, I did recruit blind and visually impaired participants. So here's a joke told to me by one of them. If it's offensive to you, hey, this is a blind person joke. It's not my joke. I'm just telling it on behalf of them. Blind guy goes into a store and he's got his white cane out and he's knocking things off the shelves. He's going up and down the aisles and just knocking things off the shelves. And the manager sees this happening and he comes up to the blind man and says, "Sir, can I help you?" And the blind man goes, "No, just looking." Let's take a look at a certain kind of echo, reverberation. Reverberation. Hard to say. We're just going to call it reverb, okay? What reverb is a reflection of sound by elements of the environment, like ceiling, floor, walls, chairs, other people, whatever is there. And what this does is it actually extends the duration of the sound. So in this case, this person is playing a, what even is that? I don't know. I was going to say a triangle, but it's like a square. Anyway, they're striking this object and it makes a sound and it goes to the audience. And there is the direct sound path, which is the shortest arrow. But sound is not nice and neat. It goes off in all kinds of other directions and it bounces off the ceiling and then the back wall and then it comes and bounces to the person and it's bouncing all over the place. And that line is a very long line. So what this effectively does is increases the duration of the sound, but it can also aid in localization. Now, of course, as you approach the sound source, there is less and less reverb. The farther away you are, then potentially the more there is. And again, this is assuming you're in an enclosed environment. If it's an open air environment, there's not much for those sound waves to bounce off of. So this is going to lead me into music, but what you would want to have is a balance between direct sound and indirect. Now you might think all of this indirect reflected sound is bad. It's not. Aesthetically speaking, in terms of our listening experience, we like to have direct sound, but also some indirect sound too, but not too much, not an imbalance between the two. Now we can quantify reverb. There is one variable called reverb time, and it's the time for the sound to decrease to 1/1000th of its original pressure. So you set up a microphone, you can measure the sound pressure level of the initial sound, and you wait and you wait and you wait until the sound that's reaching it is 1/1000th. It's not when it goes down to 0, because that can take a really long time. Besides, we can't really measure 0 sound. There's always some kind of sound present. It never really goes down to completely 0. Now, if you have a reverb time that is too short, the music is described as flat or dead or lifeless. It's really not that pleasant. However, if the reverb time is too long, the music is described as sounding muddy. If you ever went to a concert at the old Rexall Place, that was not designed for concerts. It was designed for hockey, okay? So what happens is a musician plays, like, let's say note number 1, and it has to go through the speakers, and it's bouncing off of the walls and everything, and you get that sound wave. But when you get that sound wave, you're also getting the direct sound from note number 2. So those two notes are overlapping in time. That's not what the musician intended for it to happen. The notes are intended to be played sequentially. And because of all this overlapping, the music just sounds really muddy, and it's not pleasant to listen to. It's actually kind of exhausting to listen to this. So based on this, there is kind of a rule of thumb. A concert hall, which is, of course, designed for music performance, should have a reverb time somewhere between 1.5 to 2 seconds. It's not a single number because not everybody's sitting exactly equidistant from the musicians. So just to give you some sense of what this sounds like, I have some artificial reverb, not with music, but with a spoken voice. So I'll start with 600 milliseconds.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
So it sounds like that person is in a great big empty room. There's a lot of echo there. Let's go to 800.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
Whoa, that sounds like an even bigger empty room. Let's try 1300.
Many factors influence speech intelligibility.
So just by manipulating this reverb time, you get a really different sense of the space that the sound is being played in. I like how we can artificially manipulate that. Now, takes me to our case study from Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. Not psychologists, but actually designers. They designed the famous Philharmonic Hall as part of Lincoln Center in New York City. So on the outside, it's obviously a nice mid-century modern building. Now the designers, however, wanted to create a sense of intimacy, and they believed, emphasis on believed, that this intimacy of feeling like you're being absorbed by the music and it's all around you. It's not like it's way far away, but you're absorbed, you're kind of integrated with the music. They believed this was all dependent on a quantity called the initial time delay gap. So this is not reverb time, okay? It's a different kind of quantity. Initial time delay gap means that the reflections of sound, the indirect sound, should follow the direct sound by no more than 20 to 30 milliseconds. Again, allowing a bit of flexibility depending on your distance and where you're sitting. Now, they came up with this by going to a number of concert halls, 54 different concert halls, and they made loads and loads and loads of measurement, which is great. I mean, I love it when they do research. They're not just kind of sitting there and going, we'll just kind of do this with a kind of rule of thumb. They actually did measurements for reverb, loudness, and initial time delay gap. They designed and built this performance space, and it was crap. People complained that the orchestra didn't seem to be playing together. It wasn't unblended. Some people said they couldn't hear the bass section at all. And one reviewer called it a great big yellow $16 million lemon. It was yellow inside. So $16 million, which in today's money is like about $1 jillion. It was so bad that musicians didn't want to perform there, and nobody wanted to pay money to sit there and listen to horrible sounding music. So it was basically shut and not used until they finally gutted it, rebuilt it, and even renamed it the Avery Fisher Hall in 1976. And reportedly now it's a very nice performance space. This is a pretty sad story because why did they have all the problems? They did all this research to try and avoid problems, and yet they had all kinds of unexpected problems anyway. So there was a lot of time and effort devoted to studying and understanding exactly what went wrong. So they did install some reflective ceiling panels, reflective of sound. However, they were too small and widely spaced. And what happened was that low frequency sounds would go up and kind of get trapped between the panels. The low frequency sounds would not get reflected down, at least not equally. Some people, again, couldn't hear the bass section. This is likely why. They did a lot of measurements of empty existing performance spaces. However, if you actually have people sitting in those seats, people are fairly dense objects, and that's going to change the dynamics of the sound. There's something called a seat dip effect. This will affect especially bass. It's going to get absorbed to some extent as sound goes from the stage and goes towards the back of the auditorium. They also had some budget constraints. They wanted to have as many seats as possible, and to do this, the side walls were concave, which was kind of the worst of both worlds. It distorted sound, it caused some echoes, and turns out the side walls were really, really important. This is what makes you feel integrated and surrounded by the orchestra, and this was just a horrible combination of unfortunate design choices. Now, again, we don't experience a single sine wave in isolation with nothing else. That's idealized. We hear sounds in a complex environment. There isn't a single source. It's a complex source. There are multiple complex sources, and they don't all cooperate. They don't wait for one sound to end before the next sound begins. They're all overlapping, and they're coming from different locations. It is a very complex environment. But think about your own experience in hearing. You're not constantly confused by where sounds are coming from. In fact, you're pretty good at determining what the sound is, where it's coming from. You have all of this information very clear. So somehow we take all of this messy noise coming at us and we're able to sort it out. Bregman has proposed a two-stage process in which we make sense out of all of these incoming sound sources. Stage 1 applies primitive grouping. Grouping, hopefully that's tweaking something in your memory. These are like Gestalt laws. It is very much bottom-up processing. There are certain similarities in sound over space or over time, and we group them on the basis of that similarity. So some of the important variables include intensity. So although a sound might get quieter and louder over time, typically a sound source is maintained over time, more or less. Temporal change, frequency change, location, timbre. Typically a thing that's making a sound doesn't change in all of these variables from moment to moment. It is somewhat consistent over time. So that allows us to perform grouping. So for example, grouping things over time called sequential integration, and grouping things over frequency spectra, which is called simultaneous integration. The net result is we get these auditory streams. Although the sound that's arriving at our ears is all of this overlapping, mushed together, mixed together sounds, our experience is that of separate sound sources. And again, they seem to belong together, say, over time or in other ways. If there are two people having a conversation, for example, you understand that they are having a conversation with each other. Let me give you some illustrations of some of this. One demo is called the horse versus Morse. So what is common throughout this is it's a repeating pattern, which goes low frequency, high frequency, low frequency, bit of a pause, and then it repeats low, high, low, low, high, low, low, high, low. And what we can manipulate is what is the difference in frequency between the low and the high frequency tones. Otherwise, the timing and everything is kept the same. So if we have a small frequency separation, we tend to experience the sequence as a single stream. Let's play that. thought that was going to go on forever. Okay, so this is the horse. Okay, so if you've ever tried to make the sound of a galloping horse, it's da-da-dum, 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 da-da. It's a single horse, right? It's the different hoof beats, but it's a horse. Da-da-dum, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-dum. Apparently it's a three-legged horse. But okay, whatever. Nothing wrong with that. So let's manipulate this frequency separation to have a large frequency separation, keeping everything else the same. Okay, so that it might have taken a few moments for that to get going because you might have been primed by the horse example, but this second example is called the Morse because you seem to have two separate streams. One that's low frequency going boop, 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 and completely separate from that, a high frequency going beep, 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 beep. So they're two separate. Why am I even trying to do that with my voice? I don't know. The main point is that you can experience it two different ways by just manipulating a physical variable in a very simple kind of a way. If you want to listen to those sounds again, I'm not going to play them. I'm not going to try to do them with my voice. Just, I don't know, rewind the video. Okay, so this is all part of the primitive grouping stage. We also can then apply, you know what, that was bottom up, so what are we waiting for? Yeah, we know it. We know it's coming. Top-down processing called schema-driven grouping, in which now our experience or our expectations come into play. It's our knowledge, it's things that we know. What we can do, potentially, is direct our attention to a certain sound. And of course, what attention does is it allows us to extract more information. We get more detail. We're ignoring other things, but focusing on one aspect. You can do this, pick your favorite piece of music, and just pay attention to one of the instruments. You can do that. You can pick a pop song and just listen to the vocals, and you can play it again and just focus on the bass guitar, play it again, and just focus on the lead guitar, the keyboards, or the drums. There are a few different places in town where if you bring your car in for service, they actually have a poster hanging up that says, "Don't tell us if your car is making a funny sound." We want to know, what is the sound? Is it a pinging? Is it a thumping? Is it a banging? Is it a clinking? Is it a clunking? Because all of those different sounds have different meaning to a mechanic, and that can help with diagnosing what's wrong with your car. If you have that experience, it's not just, oh, it's a funny noise, but the specific noise helps them to diagnose your car. Cartoon time. Yeah, this looks like the place where I bring my car. And I'll stop there.